Across languages and cultures, poetry has great potential to move its audiences. This is true whether it is vocalized through speaking or chant or song. It is also true if it is performed not with the voice but in the mind or even with the hands. The message cannot simply be separated from the form that the message takes because it is verbal art. The form is intricately related to the message and the experience of that message. A quality poetic translation of any poem or poetic text is truly a remarkable feat. It is in itself a work of verbal art. To be clear, the poetic texts of the Bible do not have to be translated as poetry in the target language to produce a quality translation. An analogous situation in translation of ancient texts is the translation of Homer's epics. Many translators have strategically chosen different meters and rhyme schemes to achieve their artistic purposes, while some translators have intentionally chosen to translate the epics into prose. With regard to Bible translations in English, even though most standard English translations now graphically lineate biblical poetic texts, these translations are not what most English poets would consider verse poetry, at least not according to any conventions of English metrical or free verse. Graphic lineation does not a poem make. The reality is that intentionally poetic translation is not usually a priority for English Bible translations. But among the diverse communities of the world, including some English-speaking ones, some recipients of translations may desire and value poetic translations of Scripture's poetry for any number of reasons. The translation of the biblical poetic texts as poetry in the target language raises challenges of not just how to communicate the message, but also how to fashion poetic structures in the target language that create a similar potential for poetic effects as those in the source text. I am a biblical scholar, not a translator or a poet. My research has centered on the poetry of the Hebrew Bible, trying to understand what makes a line and a poem in this literary tradition that is so different from my own. To address these issues, I have drawn especially from the field of cognitive poetics, which seeks to explore the relationships between poetic structures and effects in ways that are both universally applicable and context-specific. In this presentation, my purpose is to share some of the things that I have learned about biblical Hebrew poetry that may be relevant for translators. This is a necessarily cursory overview. More details can be found in my articles at academia.edu and especially in my recently published monograph, Unparalleled Poetry. This presentation explores two essential and interrelated aspects of biblical Hebrew poetry, which I will simply refer to as biblical poetry. The first is the versification principle of biblical poetry, or what makes a line a line. The second is the figuration of the whole, or what makes a poem a poem. First, the versification principle of biblical poetry, what makes a line a line. Let me explain what I mean by these terms. There are no biblical Hebrew terms for these concepts. I am using English language terms that have cross-linguistic validity and usefulness beyond the English poetry tradition. Verse poetry or poetry is a verbal art, either oral or written, that is composed in lines, which need not be a graphic phenomenon. Barbara Herrnstein Smith provides this helpful perceptual description. As soon as we perceive that a verbal sequence has a sustained rhythm, that it is formally structured according to a continuously operating principle of organization, we know that we are in the presence of poetry. The line is the basic unit of poetic structure and poetic rhythm. It is an aural and temporal phenomenon, and sometimes a visual one. Because many poetries of the world are not visual, and because the English term line introduces linear conceptual baggage, I would prefer a different term for this basic unit, but I have not yet come up with a better option. Poetic rhythm involves the interplay of the rhythm of speech with the line. When music or singing is part of the performance, poetic rhythm may also interact with musical rhythm. Poetic rhythm, a perceived phenomenon, is dependent upon the perception of the line as a gestalt, an organized whole. The line is the distinguishing feature of verse poetry from prose. It is central to the cognitive poetic experience because poetic rhythm is dependent upon the line, poetic effects are dependent upon the line, and the larger emergent structure, or figuration, is dependent upon the line. A versification principle is the ongoing operating principle of patterning or organization that produces the basic unit of structure and rhythm, the line. In one sense, we can speak objectively of patterning and organization. However, patterning and organization must emerge in real-time oral and temporal perception in the listener's or reader's cognitive experience in order to produce poetic effects. This is why you can't skim a poem. The following three examples demonstrate three different influential versification systems of English poetry. The first example is from Middle English alliterative verse. The pattern is 4 strong stresses per line, a sharp caesura or pause midline, and alliteration of stressed syllables within each line across the caesura. The second example is from English accentual syllabic verse. This poem's pattern is 5 feet of unstressed stress syllable patterning per line with a line and rhyme scheme of AABB. The third example is from modern English free verse. In free verse, the prosody of each poem must be discovered on its own terms, and graphic lineation usually contributes to that discovery. The patterning of this poem includes visual shape, word repetition, alliteration, and stress pause patterns. This brings us to the question of what the line is in biblical poetry and what the versification principle is. Answering these questions is challenging for several reasons. First, the Hebrew manuscript tradition never developed a standard graphic format for indicating poetic structure. Special formatting of poems that occurs does not necessarily indicate poetic structure. The vast majority of poetry in the manuscripts is in running format, like prose. Second, the lines of biblical poetry are not text internally end-marked, for example, with a device like rhyme. Third, the oldest performance tradition that we have, the medieval Masoretic vocalization of the texts, includes an accentual system that arguably represents the prosodic phrase structure. This structure does not simply map onto poetic structure. As a result, simplistic approaches using the accents as line end markers are problematic. If you are interested in this, attend Sophia Pitcher's presentation at this conference. Fourth, the lines of biblical poetry do not follow a consistent sound pattern or meter. Recent scholarly consensus considers biblical poetry free rhythm poetry. This raises the question of whether biblical poetry is free verse and whether we can approach it in a way analogous to English free verse. Several foundational differences preclude this. English free verse arose out of and in response to the metrical tradition. It is verse that has been freed from metrical constraints. In contrast, biblical Hebrew free rhythm poetry did not derive from a metrical tradition. Thus, English free verse still strategically uses metrical patterns or feet in its rhythms, while biblical Hebrew poetry does not use rhythmic patterns in an analogous way. Another key difference is that English free verse is able to exploit visual line boundaries and visual shapes for structure and effects, unlike biblical Hebrew poetry. The biblical poetic line is oral and temporal, but not visual. The line does not emerge in relation to an ongoing abstract sound pattern. Rather, the line emerges in relation to other lines. In the early language of Robert Lowth, before he settled on the unfortunate term parallelism, the lines of biblical poetry fit to each other in conformation, that is, not simply in correspondence, but by arrangement of parts and assembly into a whole. There are various reasons why I and other scholars have rejected the term parallelism. The most important one in the context of this presentation is that parallelism introduces a linear conceptual metaphor for line relationships. Parallelism provides a visual image of two lines that never meet. A better conceptual metaphor for the lines and line groupings of biblical poetry is that of a figure. A figure is two-dimensional, it has shape. It can be described as being made up of lines, if we broaden our definition to include not just straight lines, but also other segments like arcs or zigzags. The possibilities of a figure are endless, yet it may look familiar as we see it being drawn, and we may even predict the outcome as we see it start to take shape. One of the remarkable aspects of these figures in biblical poetry is that any aspect of language potentially contributes to their structure. For example, sounds, word repetitions, word order, phrasing, syntax, and even semantics. The versification principle of biblical poetry can be described as conformation. Lines fit to lines within line groupings. Line groupings are often line pairs or line triples, but they can be larger. Unintegrated lines are occasional, and I discuss them in detail in my book. Cognitively speaking, the lines and line groupings of biblical poetry are in part-whole relationships. Each line is a genuine part of the whole line grouping. Each line grouping is an integrated whole. The cognitive demand or expectation placed on a listener or reader is to mentally organize poetic structure as it unfolds orally into part-whole relationships of lines and line groupings. Parts must be segregated and wholes must be integrated. If this mental organization does not happen, the line cannot be heard. While it may sound remarkable, this kind of part-whole processing is something that humans do all the time in perception, and it has been studied extensively in Gestalt psychology. We can see this versification principle at work in this line triple, the opening of Psalm 100. Viewing this segment of text as a line triple is not controversial, even though the first line is in verse 1 and the next two lines are in verse 2. The genuine parts of the whole are the clauses, each of which begins with an imperative. The patterning of the whole line triple includes repetition of words and particles. Notice also the semantic connection between the first and last words, both of which express noise. It is the patterning of the whole line grouping that makes each line a line. That is, that makes each line an organized, genuine part of the whole. There is nothing about each line by itself that makes it a line. The same versification principle of part-whole organization, requiring the segregation of parts and the integration of the whole, is at work in the opening of Psalm 1, though the patterning is different. The lineation of this verse is disputed, and some scholars have questioned whether it is poetry at all. In Unparalleled Poetry, I argue that the first line can be segregated as a line due to the sound similarity of Ashereh Ha'ish Asher. The cohesion of a line through sound similarity is not uncommon in biblical poetry, and it resembles the use of alliteration in Old and Middle English poetry that binds each line together across a line medial caesura. Notice that sound similarity also frames the final line of the verse, and is thus part of the patterning of the whole line grouping, not just the first line. It is much easier to translate the opening of Psalm 100 in English as an integrated line triple than it is to translate Psalm 1:1 as 4 integrated English lines. This is an example of how lines and versification principles go together. Translating Psalm 1:1 according to the Hebrew lines, but not according to any integrated patterning of the whole line grouping, produces an odd and unpoetic English text. Even worse, it inappropriately introduces English enjambment and its effects into the first line. Happy the man who. If translators want to translate according to the poetic feel of the Hebrew, they must pay attention to both the Hebrew lines and how the lines fit into line groupings. Another option for the translator is to choose a versification system native to the target language. Perhaps Middle English alliterative verse could work for Psalm 1:1, and translate the Hebrew line groupings into lines that fit that patterning instead. Another challenging line grouping for English translation comes from Judges 5:25. This line pair is semantically symmetrical. Symmetry is an important principle of organization of wholes in biblical poetry, found in line groupings, stanzas, and whole poems. It refers to similarity, not just of components, but also of their position in the whole. Thus, semantic symmetry of a line pair refers to similarity of certain components according to semantic aspects, organized in relation to the whole. The whole line grouping is different from the sum of its parts, even semantically. In Judges 5:25, the symmetry of the whole organizes two semantic components of each line: Jael's action of bringing a milk product, the second phrase in each line, and Jael's action as hospitable, semantically derived from the whole of each line. Because we are not used to mentally organizing poetic lines this way in English, it sounds like Jael brought two consecutive items, milk and curds. In Hebrew, the bringing of the milk and the bringing of the curds, or better, curdled milk, refer to the same event. It is the expectation for part-whole line grouping organization that makes symmetrical structures a good cognitive fit for biblical Hebrew poetry. It is the absence of this expectation for English poetic lines, even parallel contiguous ones, that contributes to the difficulty of translating this line pair into English. In this verse, the challenge is not just differences in linguistic structures between languages, but also the challenge of the differing cognitive strategies that listeners or readers bring to a poem. Part-whole cognitive strategies in general, however, are not foreign to the demands of English poetry. Any English poem is much more than the sum of its lines or stanzas. What makes a poem is not just lines, it is also the figuration of the whole. Figuration describes how the poem comes together as a whole. Margaret Freeman writes, "It is not the individual features of a given poem that determine its structure. It is rather the overall poem's prosody, its total configuration of sounds and patterns, that constitutes the shape of the whole." Figuration captures the Gestalt notion of the whole in a given poem, its shape and sound, its rhythmic movement in time and space. In biblical poems, the line groupings come together to form larger shapes or figures through the artistry of the poet. Through figuration, the poem emerges as a meaningful, artful whole. The first example of figuration is a portion of the Song of the Sea. What I am going to highlight is the interplay of line groupings and figures to create rhythm and movement in the song. This first excerpt is verse 9, the speech of the enemy. The two line triples emerge through two distinct patterns. The first line triple exploits the phrasing shapes for lines, drawing the words together through word initial sound similarity. The final word of the line triple begins with a different sound. This contributes to the closure of the first pattern. The second line triple exploits clauses, which are also phrasing shapes for lines. These three lines are integrated through line final similarity, the first person suffix e. This portion is the entire stanza with verse 9 in the middle. I do not have time to defend this lineation here. You can find that in my book. What I want to draw attention to is how the part-whole arrangement of the lines into line groupings produces changing rhythmic patterning in the text. The stanza begins with two line pairs. The yellow highlights mark lines of two-word phrasing patterns. The rhythm changes in the middle of the next line triple, in the middle of verse 8, at the blue highlights to lines of two-word plus one-word phrases. In the yellow line 8a, God breathes to pile up the waters, and in the blue lines, the water stands up and the sea congeals. Another rhythmic change comes in verse 9 at the green highlights. These are the line triples with short two-word lines. This is the speech of the enemy. With verse 10, the original rhythm of the yellow highlights resumes. God blows, as he previously breathed in the last yellow highlight line. The sea moves again, and the enemy sinks in the magnific waters. The rhythmic shapes and movements of this stanza contribute to the figuration of the whole, how it is experienced and even interpreted. For the translator who desires to translate this song as a poem, although all its shapes are interesting, including the olive repetitions in 9a through c, the translator cannot reproduce every poetic shape in the target language. The concept of figuration of the whole may help guide which shapes are the most essential to reflect in translation. A final example involves the interplay of lines within figures to create and resolve perceptual forces. Two contiguous stanzas in Deborah's song use structures of symmetry for quite contrasting effects. The first is verses 4 and 5, in which Yahweh's grand movement is on display. The figure is chiastically arranged. The patterning is visually marked in this slide. These patterns, however, must unfold temporally in oral verbal art. Unfolding symmetrical patterns create the expectation for completion. For the sake of time, I will just visually show you how the pattern unfolds line by line. The discussion can be found in my book or my article on symmetry. First two lines are symmetrical. We get a different line and a slightly different line with some similarities. And the symmetry emerges in the 8 lines as a whole. The important point here is that the unfolding AA, B, C, C, B, AA pattern creates the expectation for how it will be completed. Because these expectations get met, the completion of the pattern can be experienced as a closed and stable shape. Stable shapes are often associated with certainty. Here's the following verse with its patterning visually marked. Unlike Yahweh's grand movement, the oppressed Israelites can only take roundabout paths. These textual patterns are only interesting if experienced temporally. Again, for the sake of time, I will show them, but not explain them in detail. The second line brings near symmetry, but with imbalance. There's no equilibrium. The fourth line is grammatically incomplete, a thwarted four-line symmetry. The word twisting thwarts the two-line symmetry, but balances and closes the five-line figure. In this figure, expectations are set up, but they are repeatedly thwarted until the figure comes to a close. As a result, the temporal experience is one of instability and unpredictability, that is, uncertainty. These two figures showcase the artistry of a biblical poet, how the poet has crafted structures that can emerge orally and temporally with the potential to produce poetic effects. It may or may not be possible for a translator to create these kinds of structures of symmetries or thwarted symmetries within her target language's versification system. However, understanding the relationship between structures and effects in the Hebrew poem may help the translator decide if similar effects could be achieved by different structures of language in the target language, or even through music. To sum up, lines are central to experiencing and interpreting verse poetry. It is not enough to lineate biblical texts. As in other versification systems, we must attempt to understand the nature of the line in its versification system, the principles by which it is formed, and the cognitive strategies it demands. Lines added together do not make a poem, nor do individual features determine structure or effects. The line groupings of biblical poetry come together to form figures by which the poem emerges orally and temporally as an organized whole. Figuration is what makes a poem a poem.